Welcome to the Sphysics podcast, where we cultivate conversations on science and spirit. Our goal? To encourage an atmosphere of free thought and liberty in the exchange of ideas. I'm Sean Grady, and this week our special guest also happens to be my co-host, Dr. Jesse Adams. Dr. Adams holds a Ph.D. in nanotechnology from Stanford University. He is an author of textbooks on the subject, founder of the company Nevada Nano, a multi-patent holder, and chief architect of a micro-fabricated target for a high-powered laser-generated proton beam. Adams has walked with the upper echelon of academia, with scientific juggernauts and heavy-hitting political power brokers. He comes to us as one who has schmoozed with society's elite, and, having visited that country, sends back a postcard reporting that the food is incredible, the weather pleasant, but the prevailing worldviews seem, strangely, lacking. For Adams, the experiences this world has to offer scarcely hold a candle to his own personal encounters with a living, purposeful Creator God. Dr. Adams, thank you so much for joining us on Sphysics. It's a pleasure to have you as our guest.
Hey, thank you. It's great to be here.
Now, you have a very unique degree, nanotechnology PhD from Stanford. Can you tell us a little bit about that degree? What got you into that field? Did you know going into college that was going to be your endpoint?
No, the only thing I knew when I went to college is that I didn't want to be a dentist. I liked engineering because I saw MacGyver when I was in 6th grade. I watched MacGyver shows. I was like, what is this guy? So I saved up as much of my money as I could, like pennies and nickels, to buy my first Swiss Army pocket knife. I think it cost $22. I still remember saving up to get my Swiss Army pocket knife. I felt like I could do anything in the world because I had a Swiss Army pocket knife, and MacGyver could do anything in the world because he had a Swiss Army pocket knife. And I did. I actually had my pocket knife, and then I learned I could do things with paper clips. So I shut off all the lights and fans in the new 6th grade building at my middle school and got sent to the principal's office. They thought it was interesting because I figured out you could use the paperclip as a janitor's key, and I thought it was the coolest thing. They said, don't do that, you could electrocute yourself. I don't think that's necessarily true, but I didn't like being in trouble, so I got in trouble. And then my 6th grade science teacher didn't like to teach science, and we had a new kit. So me and my friend Lewis became the science teachers for 6th grade. And one of the experiments we read about was if you throw flour in the air and light it on fire, it makes a huge flame cloud. So we went in the bathroom and threw flour in there and lit it on fire. I mean, it's a miracle that we're all still okay. And I think we were able to do it in the class. It's probably the most shocking, dangerous, unsanctioned science class that ever existed in the recent history in Nevada. But I really had a love for science, figuring out how stuff works. And as you mentioned in the intro, had these encounters with God, and had this insatiable desire to create and be creative. I remember making a recording when I was in 7th or 8th grade saying, I'm going to invent things. And I just made this recording. I don't know exactly why. I didn't know what I was going to invent, but I said I was going to invent things. So when it got to the high school time period and it got to the end of high school, I'd applied to several different colleges, actually to a lot of different colleges, and I just competed. We didn't have a lot of money. So my friends had like a Nintendo or Atari growing up. And it was always like the friends had stuff. And once in a while, we had enough money where I could get something from a garage sale. So I think because I was bored, that's why I started doing well in school. So I'm trying to bore my kids more. I don't think I'm doing a good enough job. I didn't have much to do at home, so I would study and compete and answer questions and take apart toys that I had. So I'm getting at why I went into engineering here. So I did well in high school, middle school, went to a summer science program at Lawrence Livermore National Labs and got to program on Cray supercomputers when I was in high school. That was super cool. We did this thing called email, never heard of it. We were sending little messages to each other in the internal email, and it was like, oh, that's cool. And then Yeah, it was really cool. I wish I'd done more with that at the time. And then towards the end of high school, time to apply to colleges. So we applied to the best colleges. I applied to Stanford. I got on the waiting list, kind of bummed about that. Got into UC Irvine, got into UNR, and I declared that I was going to UC Irvine. And then just like a week or so before the end of school, when I was taking out the garbage, I had been praying that kind of month because I saw dust on my Bible. I had encounters with God when I was younger. Hey, I was praying, God, make me want to read your Bible. So I'd started praying this prayer because I saw dust. I hadn't opened my Bible. And I literally felt like God spoke to me and said, you need to go to UNR when I was taking the garbage out. And I was like, I don't want to go to UNR. That's the local college. I want to go to the ocean and play volleyball. And it's going to be awesome. And I know some people down there, and I know one person down there, and go to concerts and volleyball and the beach and surf or whatever. And then I said, what about my friends? What are my friends going to think? Because they knew I was going to UC Irvine, and we were trying to go to the best colleges we could go to. So I knew that I knew. So on the graduation of high school, it says, announcement, it says I'm going to UC Irvine, but I didn't go to UC Irvine. I went to UNR. And the day before school started, in the week of school, I met my future wife at a Bible study, which was super awesome. And when they asked me to declare my major, I just said engineering because I didn't want to be a dentist. That's all I knew. I didn't want to be a dentist. I liked science and math, and I didn't like blood and cleaning teeth and that kind of stuff. That idea didn't appeal to me. I didn't want to be an electrical engineer because I couldn't see what I was doing. I didn't want to be a civil engineer because I didn't want to work with dirt. So I started out in mechanical engineering. It was like kind of the middle ground. It was like Goldilocks. It was just right. And loved it. So I did mechanical engineering at UNR and a business minor. And then I wanted to drop out of school and follow and support Eridad Mukasa traveling the world, ministering to people in the power of God. And we could talk about that later if you want. And then on a phone call in February 14th, 1996, called up Eridad. I was like, look, this is what I'm going to do. And oh, by the way, I just won the National Science Foundation Fellowship and got a full ride to Stanford for grad school, but I don't really want to do that. And he was like, listen, Moses was in the courts of Pharaoh with the movers and shakers. You need to go. And I was like, okay. And I looked at, I was accepted to Purdue for graduate school, and I was accepted to Stanford for graduate school. Flew out to Purdue, checked out Purdue, took my first pilot's lesson there, flew a little plane. They have an airstrip right in the middle of the campus. Just did a one-day tour, checked out the engineering, talked to the group, one of the professors in Jewish studies, who I'd been following about the goings-on in Hebron, Israel at the time. And I'm talking to him, and he goes, you need to go to Stanford. It has the joy de vivre. So he's like, they had just finished showing me the tunnels in Purdue, that this is how cold it gets. You have to walk in tunnels during the winter underneath the street so you don't freeze to death or whatever. And he's like, you need to go to Stanford. So I had these two guys kind of command me to go to Stanford. And I thought, well, this is all part of the world system and so the high echelon. And I don't know. And I just want to be with God. But I had this ticket, this golden ticket. And so I packed up my Suburban and drove down there and just kind of dinked into the service vehicle sign at my dorm at Crothers Memorial Hall and had the time of my life. It was the most amazing place of resources and insight and ideas, and met with God and with amazing people there. So I'm really glad I went, and it was good advice from Eridad and the professor of Jewish studies at Purdue. And there I specialized at first in the mechatronics, which had 3/4 of programming robots. It turned mechanical engineers into electrical engineers as much as they could, where you'd understand circuits and software, and you got to do cool stuff. So we made robots that would compete with each other. And there's the ME218 sequence, and it was a lot of fun. It was really hard, a lot of time. And then I did the other courses as well. And after the master's degree, I kind of had the itch to go do another project, and I wanted to go study wind turbines in Patagonia. So I had a project lined up with the the National Renewable Energy Lab, NREL, to actually go to Patagonia, like live in a hut, apparently, like on a windy coast, and study wind turbines down there. And I just didn't have a peace about it. I was like, something's not right about this. And again, right towards the end of my master's degree, I made the decision that I wasn't going to do that, and I had nothing else to do. So I had 2 more years. The fellowship from the National Science Foundation that I had won gives you 3 years of funding. I had used 9 months to do the master's degree, and I had basically 2 more years and a summer of basically free classes at Stanford University. So I was like, well, let's see. So I kind of just wandered into campus, looked around. I started working on the free electron laser. I worked on the artificial star project, and then met Cal Quate. And towards the end of our discussions, he's like, you need an advisor from Nevada, because he was born and raised in Nevada, and I was from Nevada, and really fell in love with the project and the team. And they sent me to Switzerland to give a talk, and I got to work on building the atomic force microscope. I got to meet Gerd Benning, who is the co-inventor of the atomic force microscope and invented the scanning tunneling microscope. He's a co-inventor on that, won the Nobel Prize, and got to meet him in Switzerland. So really cool stuff happened. And that took me from mechatronics into nanotechnology, microfabrication, and then wrapping up the PhD was a combination of all of what I had learned there, plus turning it into an online distributed course, studying distance learning and how people learn in the education component with Larry Leifer from the Stanford Learning Lab. And that's how I wrapped up my PhD.
Wow, that sounds like just a high density compacted experience within a relatively short time frame. Tell me about the artificial star project.
Yeah, the artificial star project was awesome. They were working on Einstein's theory of relativity and proving and looking at what would happen with gyroscopes in space. And they were going to lock the satellite in to I think it's called Gravity Probe B. They were going to lock the satellites onto stars as they were going around the Earth to do this study into Einstein's theory. And they needed to practice, so they needed an artificial star. And I don't remember all of the details, but they wanted an artificial star to do some practice on how the satellites would lock in on this. And they needed some electronics done. And I had taken the ME218 class, and so I got a job working on some of the electronics. And I remember these guys were down in like the basement of the free electron laser, which was like 3 or 4 stories below Stanford's campus. And you punch your code in this door, and then you go down these musty, dank stairwell to the very bottom, and there's these 2 guys just like full of energy in this cave like laboratory with this old receiver, and like a full-sized iguana is sitting there warming itself on the receiver, and they've got electronics and things all around. So it was cool to work on that project, and then to play a small role in something that was much bigger, Gravity Probe B.
Wow, that's exciting. And your experience, though, wasn't just limited to scientific endeavors, too. You hosted a series of talks on campus.
One of the things I noticed in undergrad, and then I think in grad school, is that the resident assistants got the best rooms. And somewhere along the line, I signed up to be a graduate residence assistant, a GRA, for Crothers Memorial Hall, which was the international graduate dorm on campus. And it's just almost a stone's throw from the Hoover Institute, which is an amazing place, and George Shultz was working there, Condoleezza Rice, William Perry, all had an association with the Hoover Institute at Stanford. And it crossed my mind through some of the people I was meeting that one thing that would be awesome is to host a speaker series for my dorm. I have an international dorm of graduate students. We're surrounded by all these people. What if I had a pizza night and brought in these speakers? So I started reaching out to the top thought leaders that, you start to become like who you hang out with. So I was like, why don't we just get the best people, the most successful people on campus to come in and speak to us? Wouldn't that be great? And so I reached out to the Hoover Institute, and we got George Shultz to come over, William Perry. I think he had to cancel because he got flown to Washington, and then we had to reschedule him. We were scheduling Condoleezza Rice, and then she had to cancel. But we got William Perry, George Shultz, and then I kind of expanded it to Nobel laureates. We had 1 or 2 Nobel laureates from, I think, physics on campus. And then Edward Teller also had his house on campus. He and his wife were living there in his very late age, the late years with assisted living on campus. He literally lived across the street from a section of Stanford campus. So we drove over to his house, picked him up, brought him over, and he was such a hit. We had him come 2 or 3 times over to the dorm. And we expanded into the basement once for a bigger venue. But it was just fascinating to hear these guys speak. The one I remember most was George Shultz, former Secretary of State under Reagan. The door was locked to the dorm when we came, and he goes, "That's a great way to get people to come hear me speak." He gave me the dig about the door being locked. And when we got inside, we had dinner with pizza, and he's speaking. And when someone asked him a question, he would pause, then formulate his thought, and come out with this beautiful paragraph. He would never say, he would never rush, and everything he said was eloquent. He would just let there be this like pregnant pause over the room, and just pause like that in order to create the perfect sentence. And then he would present his perfect sentence. It was awesome. I learned that from him. It was fantastic to watch how he did it. And then William Perry, Secretary of Defense under Clinton, we were driving around trying to find a parking place in his Jeep Cherokee. Talking to him was cool as well. And then Edward Teller, that's a whole other story. That was awesome.
Yeah, tell us about Ed Teller. He had to have been in the twilight of his life at that point, somewhere in his 90s, yeah?
Yeah, I don't know what level of 90s. I'm pretty sure it was 90s. Like it was in there. But I was concerned. I was even concerned when we picked him up. We put him in my friend's sports car. It's just kind of surreal. One of the guys from my dorm, we had this cool white sports car. We're driving him over to the dorm, and I'm sitting in the back. Edward Teller's sitting in the passenger seat. My friend's driving, and he would respond and talk, but he would kind of have his head tilted back, both eyes almost closed, one eye half open. He was really, really old, and I'm sitting here thinking, how's this going to go? You've advertised, people are coming to hear a speaker, and I'm concerned that maybe this car ride was too much. That was kind of the level we were at. How's this going to go, right? And so you're bringing in your speaker who's the inventor of the hydrogen bomb, but he doesn't look very energetic, at least not first appearances. And then we get him in his chair. We kind of help him walk to his chair, and he sits there, kind of still looks like he did in the car. And he starts talking, and so that's good. We're like, all right, cool. There's information, and there's a nice story coming out. He's giving us a nice story. But the crazy thing that I noticed was, like, when some of the younger ladies would ask questions about the early days of physics, he would get a smile on his face and light up, like both eyes open, and he'd get energized and tell us about Livermore in the early days and the destructive power of these bombs. It was fascinating. He really lit up. He was energized from the experience, and I think we had him over twice.
What an awesome experience. The thought occurred to me as you were describing these encounters with these luminaries, the movers and shakers that we read about that are literally history makers. And I just think when I read about people like them, I have this sense that they just existed out there somewhere in the tide of history and accomplished the things that they did, almost like some kind of memorial, like Mount Rushmore. I've never been there, but I've seen photos and I know about it, and it's epic. But for you to be connected to them in the way that you were and to relate some of the experiences that you had really brings it to life, and really is only an extra degree of separation. It sheds light a little bit on the character of these significant figures. Now, you mentioned the Hoover Institute.
Yeah.
I think the Hoover Institute is compelling because you mentioned about your faith in God, and for some, if not many, the tenability of being a scientist along with maintaining a belief in God or faith in Christianity is an untenable situation. And yet, for you as an engineer, you mentioned early on that your desire was to figure out how things work, to use tools.
and to extrapolate how things function, taking apart your toys. That's really a lot of what Physics, the podcast, is about, isn't it? It's, in some respects, the physics of the spirit. How does all this, life, existence, work? And is it perhaps much more interrelated and inextricably intertwined than we are led to believe? For over a century and a half, the predominant narrative has been that science and faith occupy separate domains, and never the twain shall meet. But it may be quite the opposite. I mean, Kepler, Newton, Maxwell, they were all certainly of the mindset that what exists elucidates our existence. For them, spirit and science were cords intricately woven. And so, back to the Hoover Institute. Recently, they released a YouTube video on the mathematical challenges to Darwinian evolution. Tell us a little bit about that, and what's the background there? We're talking about an institute founded by, or in honor of, President Hoover, correct? And there's a tower on Stanford's campus that's dedicated to him. How is it that they're hosting a conversation like this, the mathematical challenges to Darwinian evolution, and is that just heresy? Is that even something that should be talked about? Another part of this podcast is creating an atmosphere of free thought and liberty in the exchange of ideas. So I'd like to know what you, as someone who is not unintelligent, what are your thoughts on that? Where are you coming from, where you hold both your convictions of science and faith with equal grip?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great question. There's a lot there. So first, the Hoover Institute is something to be mentioned there and something to be honored. And there's two things to honor. One is we're honoring the legacy of the Stanfords. They lost their only son. They had just kind of doted on him, and their mission in creating Stanford University was to adopt all the children of California and give them the best education, what they would have given their only begotten son. And the heart of the Stanfords, I think, was really honored in their legacy. It's a powerful statement that they made, and you can read about it. You can see the engravings in the Memorial Church, which is at the center of campus. That's super cool, and we call it Mem Chu. And the whole thing that's so beautiful is that they wanted excellence. They wanted the best for their son, who they didn't have anymore, and they adopted the kids of California. That's why it's easier to get into Stanford if you're from California. And then they expanded that vision to the world, and they've created what is arguably one of the best universities in the entire world. And so there's that going for them, and there's that excellent spirit. Stanford is a thought leader. Harvard's a thought leader. I don't know the history of Harvard as well, but the idea is that there's certain institutions that take a stand and they say, we're going to be excellent, and that's our vision, and it attracts excellence, okay? So Stanford did that. The Hoover Institute is a think tank, and it is planted there on the Stanford campus. I don't have all the history on the Hoover Institute itself, but their goal is to be thought leaders. And so the fact that they're then hosting something on the mathematical challenges to Darwinism makes perfect sense. And it follows in line that they're willing to be out on the front line to say what everyone else is going to be saying in 20 or 30 years. And if you watch that video, you find that there's a huge problem with the origin of species. The survival of the fittest and changes and modifications and isolation, all of that kind of makes sense and is plausible. But the origin of species mathematically is mathematically challenging. It is a kind way to say that. It's impossible. You know, that might be a better way to say it. And there's not enough time for the statistics to be carried out in the time frame of a 12 to 14 billion year old universe. It just doesn't work mathematically. And so as thought leaders, they're willing to accept that, admit that, and we honor them for that. So what you'll find most likely is they point out in that video that the old guard will have to die off. And I think they're talking about the current professor pool and then the textbooks. There's old textbooks that still posit that it's possible to generate species just randomly given enough time. But as they point out, there's not enough time, and it's too complicated. And Darwin was not aware of how complicated it was that's stored in the cell and in DNA. And that has to be created by mind and intelligence. And that's the prevailing wind now. So they're just being the thought leader that they are. They're being excellent, I think, in hosting that. And that's what I would say about Hoover.
It sounds to me that rather than science working as a counter to your faith, it serves more as an underpinning. Would you say that's an accurate assessment for you?
Oh, yeah. And I wanted to tell you one of the thoughts, like you said, I love to figure out how things work. ever since I was little. I like, how does this work? How does this work? Take apart my toys. The two things that came to mind when you were talking a minute ago were the overlap between meeting Jerry Rice and Gerd Benning. Gerd Benning had the Nobel Prize won the Nobel Prize for inventing the scanning tunneling microscope with a small group and taking pictures of atoms. I mean, you can go back to ancient Greece and then connect that to Gerd Benning. It's an amazing accomplishment when he takes pictures of an atom, the unbreakable thing, right? That they thought was unbreakable. He takes this picture of an atom interacting with the electron orbitals of atoms. And when I meet him years after winning the Nobel Prize, and we're talking about tunneling electrons on a whiteboard in Switzerland, he's moving around, dancing like a child, like a kid, talking about his new puppy or a new remote control car. He's like, and then this happens, and then this happens, and this over here. Look at this, then this happens. And we're talking about an experiment that could be done or how something works, or a question I had for him in his office on his whiteboard. And he's so excited, like a little kid. So I found out how something works in watching Gerd Benning. And then meeting Jerry Rice at Stanford, he was at the Stanford golf shop. And I said, you look just like Jerry Rice. He puts his hand out, shakes my hand. It's Jerry Rice. The 49ers happened to be playing on TV in the golf shop. He was at Stanford for a knee surgery. And he and I sit there and watch the 49ers. And he's telling me about all the plays. He goes, watch this. They're going to go around to the left, and then this guy's going to do this. Jerry Rice is talking like a little kid, full of joy, full of enthusiasm. And I've heard a quote that says, joy is heaven's most serious business. And to see the joy, the childlike joy on these two world leaders, these two domain leaders, anybody who hears Jerry Rice thinks best football, best, highest echelon of football achievement. Anyone who hears about Gerd Benning and Nobel Prize winners thinks the highest echelon of science. And in a short period of time, I praise God for it, I got to see how that works. If you love your work like a little kid, there's a quote that says, if you love your job, you'll never work a day in your life. You're on a mission. You're enjoying it. And that joy that I saw, that joy was contagious with these two guys and almost identical. That's what blew my mind. Two completely disparate domains, almost identical passion and enthusiasm. And these are the guys at the top. And, it allowed them to be standing at the highest echelon of their areas. So for me, that was a huge insight. I learned a lot about engineering, but to learn about the spiritual, physical dynamic of how to excel in any area with this joy and positivity that's exuding from you and contagious, that was super cool. That was a surprise. I wasn't expecting that. It was just a cool thing to learn.
And I'd have to say, knowing you for some time now, that I think that you demonstrate that same joy about your work. And whether you're talking about the double slit experiment in quantum physics, or we're talking about cosmology, or the makeup of biological systems, or the engineering of some kind of structure or mechanism, whatever it may be, there is a joie de vivre in the way you express yourself and an excitement in the way that you come across. And I would have to say that the more that I learn personally and the more that I read about the makeup of our universe and who we are and what we are, how we are, the deeper my own sense of conviction becomes in the reality of an intelligent, purposeful creator God. Well, Jesse, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Totally.
I am looking forward to co-hosting future special guests with you on Sphysics, where we examine issues of science and spirit and encourage an environment of free thought and liberty in the exchange of ideas. I am excited about where this podcast is going, and I hope that listeners will continue to join us. If you enjoyed this podcast, make sure to subscribe and leave a rating or a like. We look forward to having you join us and our special guest on our next podcast. And until then, remember the words of Socrates, wisdom begins in wonder.